This is Michael Smook for YouTube Commentaries. Today is February 25th. It's a Saturday. We're in the year 2017. The topic of today's conversation is Madison and Hamilton, partners and rivals. The reason why we will talk about this topic, well, for starters, let's talk about the present. Now we have a lot of disharmony in this country. It was a contentious election. The Democrat candidate won by nearly 3 million votes, but the 45th president, the Republican, won by 77,000 votes, with Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania winning in the Electoral College, making a difference in the election. Now, post-election, there's a lot of disharmony where the president is having press conferences referring to the New York Times and the Washington Post, accusing them of fake news and mentioning that the press is the enemy. So the reason why we're having this conversation today is I find it comforting to look back in the early years of this country. Madison and Hamilton for a while were partners, then they were rivals. Hamilton founded the Federalist Party, and Madison, along with Jefferson, founded the Democrat-Republicans, and they saw things differently. But at the end of the day, they managed to align their interests together and find a harmony that made the United States a better place. Let's first talk about Madison. He was the fourth president of the United States. People refer to him, as many historians and political scientists refer to him, as the father of the Constitution. He's also referred to as the father of the Bill of Rights. And what about Hamilton? Well, Hamilton, now he's a Broadway hit show, but he's far greater than that, even though it's a monster hit. The author of the biography, Hamilton, which the show is based on, Ron Chernow, was asked, what is Hamilton? Washington's the father of our country. Jefferson's the father of the Declaration of Independence. What's Hamilton father of? And Ron Chernow suggested that Hamilton is the father of the federal government. And I might add, based upon my own research, that Hamilton should be credited as being the father of America's economy. These two fellows, Madison and Hamilton, we're going to talk about what they did together before, during, and after the U.S. Constitution was approved, and how they partnered together. And then that's chapter 2. Chapter 3, we're going to talk about what they did during the first, third, and fourth administrations of the presidencies. What Hamilton did as Secretary of Treasury in the first administration, and what that's Hamilton, and what Madison did as Secretary of State in the third administration, working for Thomas Jefferson, and in the fourth administration as president. Their policies, they were rivals, but eventually they managed to come together and their interests aligned, which gives us hope not only for the past, but the present and the future. And then we'll summarize. But before we do, let's go with a pre-introduction, and let me tell you a couple of quick stories that relate to me, but also involve Madison and Hamilton. I've been working for the City of New York in municipal government for 28 years. To borrow a line from the poet Carl Frost, I had to take the road not taken and work 8 or 9 years in the private and non-profit sectors, and finally get a job at a professional level, opportunity to be mid and upper mid-level analyst and manager, and that put me on the road to that success. So at that time, I worked in downtown, working in a number of offices that were located somewhere between City Hall and Wall Street. From time to time, at lunch, I would go for a walk. And one day, I came upon Trinity Church, and I walked in the back, and who did I come upon? I came upon the grave of Alexander Hamilton. He died in a duel against the Vice President Aaron Burr in 1804. He was 2 months shy of being 48 years old. buried next to him is his wife, Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton. So the thing about Hamilton is it felt like hollowed ground coming upon where he's buried. And all I can say is that from time to time, having been reading about one of the major documents he and Madison produced post Constitutional Convention, the Federalist Papers, I was reading up on Hamilton and Madison and coming upon his grave. I would talk to him about his work. Mostly I'd talk and he'd listen, but it was good to visit him. Even though he's been gone for over 200 years, somehow visiting his grave, I felt closer to him. My second Madison-Hamilton story stems from the fact in 1990, I had been working for the city 12 to 18 months. I applied for a job to be a press officer, to work directly for the mayor of the city of New York, David Dinkins. The end of the story is I interviewed for the job, I didn't get the job, and unfortunately Dinkins, even though the city was turning a quarter on crime and the economy, he was not reelected. He lost to Rudolph Giuliani. But the Hamilton-Madison part of the story stems from the fact that I walked into City Hall where the mayor works and the city council works, and I interviewed with David Dinkins, #1 political operative, his press secretary. His name was Jones, Press Secretary Jones, Leland Jones, that is. And the first question he asked me, he said, "Well, do you have a question?" And I said, "Well, how am I going to be trained?" And he said, "You're going to be trained through exposure or immersion." And what I knew that meant to be was, we're going to throw you in the deep end of the pool and you're going to either sink or swim. So that was a challenge, but and I had some nervous laughter. And then his next question was, "Well, what are you reading?" And I said, "Well, I'm reading the Federalist Papers," which of course was written by Madison and Hamilton post Constitutional Convention, outlining what government should look like once it replaced the Articles of Confederation. Anyway, what surprised me was Leland Jones responded by giving absolutely no response. He said nothing. He didn't shrug his shoulders. He didn't say aha. He didn't say anything. And I left and I returned his non-response by giving a non-response. I didn't blink. I didn't shrug my shoulders. I kept a poker face, and at best, I had a Mona Lisa smile on my face. I walked out of City Hall. City Hall looks like a museum with the oak paneling and the paintings of mayors from 100 and 200 years ago. It looks like a museum. And I walked out of there actually disappointed with Jones. But upon sober reflection, a quarter of a century later, I think Jones deserves more credit. He may not have known about Madison and Hamilton's work on the Federalist Papers, but as the mayor's, one of his #1 political operatives, he knew everything. He understood what was going on in Washington, D.C., the federal structure of our federal government, passing laws and appropriating funds and transmitting it to the city of New York. Jones also knew about what was going on in Albany with the governor and the legislature, and they in turn were passing laws, appropriating funds, and sending money to the city of New York. So understanding what was going on in this federal structure between the federal government, state, and local government, as Leland Jones, as Mayor Dinkins' #1 political operative, he knew all about the federal papers, except that he didn't know the name, but he understood how it worked. So in fairness to Jones, he did a good job, and it was unfair because Dinkins was a good mayor, but he was mayor at the wrong time. Now that we've covered the pre-introduction, and we've already talked about the introduction, let's jump ahead to Chapter 2 as to what did Madison and Hamilton do before, during, and after the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia between May and September 1787. It's interesting, Hamilton and Madison were both legislators. They were in the Continental Congress. Hamilton represented New York, and Madison represented Virginia. And they knew the severe problem with the United States in the first 10 years after the Declaration of Independence, that the central government was too weak. There was no executive branch, no president. Congress was unicameral. It was just the Continental Congress. It was nearly impossible to raise revenue. The states were able to raise some revenue. It was nearly impossible to have a standing army to defend the country. What Madison and Hamilton did is they appeared to colleagues in the Continental Congress, and they're saying something needs to be done so we could strengthen the Articles of Confederation. They were given permission. So what happened in September of 1786 was that Madison and Hamilton reached out to colleagues, and 12 legislators met in Annapolis, Maryland, representing just 5 states, and this convention only lasted 4 days. And what Madison and Hamilton learned was that they needed to, the Congress, the Continental Congress needed to redouble its effort to have a much more robust constitutional convention and to try again. They were commissioned to they were given permission to follow up. So what Madison and Hamilton did was they hands-on made sure that 70 letters went out to men of stature throughout the 13 colonies. Now this is the 18th century. We're talking about white men, not people of color, and not women, but these men were products of their time. And the good thing about America is things have changed and for the better. But let's deal with this situation right now. So what happened was, within 8 months, 55 out of 70 people invited to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, they agreed to come, and they did come. And over 4 months, they went back and forth and finally hammered out a constitution. As far as, well, by the end of the 4 months, of the 55 who attended, 42 remained. And 39 people, founding fathers, signed the Constitution, and 3 declined. So 39 out of 70. That's who we ended up with. George Washington, presided over this convention, and it was a cooperative and collaborative effort. There was enough credit to go around to everyone. But perhaps the most essential man at that convention was James Madison. Madison took copious notes, minutes of the debate and what was decided upon. Actually, before all that, he brought together a plan called the Virginia Plan. It was a template that was brought to the convention. It's been also called the Randolph Plan after a fellow Virginian. And so it was a point of departure, and Madison is, he was collaborative and cooperative. He was a diminutive man, 5'4", 100 pounds, but he's not the kind of guy who would inflame passions, and he's somebody you wanted to partner with and work with. But he did take copious notes throughout the convention on 200 separate occasions. He did speak up and participate, and he was the essential man throughout this constitutional convention. Hamilton spoke up less, and he needed to travel back to New York because he was married and had an ever-growing family. Even though he married into a wealthy family, making money was up to him. He had a burgeoning law practice. He had to leave the convention and leave from Philadelphia, come back to New York to earn a living, and then he came back to the convention. He was one of the 39 people who signed the Constitution. He did speak up from time to time at the convention, and among 3 of New York's representatives, he was the sole representative from the state of New York who signed the U.S. Constitution at the big convention in Philadelphia in September of 1787. What happened was added to the Constitution was a section which stated that 9 out of 13 of the original states needed to agree that the Constitution would replace the Articles of Confederation. That's one detail I neglected to, I inadvertently missed out, but let me just tell you, this convention was originally set up to merely revise and improve the Articles of Confederation. But the Articles of Confederation was weak, and shortly after the start of the convention, the conventioners agreed that we needed a new constitution. So after the Constitution was agreed to, was signed by a vote of 39-3, and 39 conventioners signed it, Madison and Hamilton decided to partner together, and they moved to New York. And in New York, Hamilton and Madison wrote 80 of 85 op-ed pieces in New York City papers. These papers also had articles reprinted in upstate New York and in some of the other states. And the plan for these op-ed pieces, these articles, was to influence the convention that was going to take place in Poughkeepsie, so the state of New York could make a determination to join the newly configured United States of America under the new Constitution. New York was very important because it certainly came between, for example, New Jersey and Connecticut. So New York was, and it was an important port facility, and after Virginia, it was the second most popular state. So it was very important that New York, almost immediately, agreed to join the newly configured United States and accept the Constitution as the supreme law of the land. Now, among these 80 articles that were later bound together in a book, they were later called the Federalist, and later they were extended. The title was extended and called the Federalist Papers. And let me just conceptualize what Madison was about. Madison was learned on forms of government from the times of the Greeks and Romans in antiquity 2,000 years ago. He studied political scholars and theorists from Britain, Locke and Hobbes, from France, Rousseau and Montesquieu, from Italy, Machiavelli, and he understood, and that was in the recent past at the time, going back 100, 200, and 300 years. So Hamilton was a scholar, and he also understood that based upon the American Revolution, we had our own specific way of looking at things, and he acknowledged and respected what we sometimes refer to as American exceptionalism. So he realized that that the Constitution, as writing about the Federalist Papers, it was not only to convince New York State, but it was convince the other states, and it was sort of a handbook on why the Constitution was important. So Madison understood that the Constitution was important because the federal government needed energy, it needed to raise revenue, and the central government or federal government needed to be stronger. But Hamilton also understood human nature. He understood that men could be greedy and selfish at times. That's at worst. At best, he understood that men could be guided by enlightened self-interest. So instead of political action committees or political parties, he didn't use, and those languages were hundreds of years in advance. When Madison wrote the Federalist Papers, his opportunities, he would talk about interest groups combining politics and finance or economics. These groups he called factions. And because he understood human nature, there needed to be checks and balances on the system, whereby if Congress passed a law and the president didn't like it, the president could veto the law, but then communists could override the law. And even before that happened, if the upper house of Congress, the Senate, passed one law and it differed from the lower house, the House of Representatives, Congress needed to come to an agreement. So Madison wanted to have a system of checks and balances where all branches of government would be strong, but no branch could completely overpower the other. So that was called a system of checks and balances. And in the early to mid-70s, when I was a government major as an undergraduate, we learned that system is known as Madisonian democracy. So that was basically Madison's take. If you condense all 29 essays he wrote, 34% of the Federalist Papers, that's basically summarizing Madison's concept of what government should be like. Hamilton filled in the rest. He believed that in Federalist Paper number 84 that the judiciary should have the right of judicial review. So the Supreme Court and the lower federal courts, in a case of original jurisdiction or upon appeal, they could try a case, hear arguments, and make a determination whether Congress and or the President were acting within constitutional bounds or whether the work that they was doing was unconstitutional. Hamilton referred to the judiciary as the least dangerous branch of government because Congress could appropriate funds and the President was commander-in-chief of the Army, but he still thought it was vital and important to spend Federalist Paper number 84 talking about how the Founding Fathers from Philadelphia viewed the concept of judicial review. Another thing that's really fascinating about Hamilton was he was 145 years ahead of his time. Hamilton's concept of what the President of the United States, we have never had a president before, and Hamilton's concept of what the president should do, we didn't see a president who could do nation building and heroic things until Franklin Roosevelt came along in March of 1933. Hamilton spoke about a president who could, in nation building, could have legislation approved and funded through Congress so we could rebuild roads and bridges, dredge harbors, build port facilities, and all the rest, and create mechanisms to have a national bank, mechanisms to print money, and also as commander-in-chief have a large enough army and navy to protect the United States against rivals and enemies in the best interests of our national security. So Hamilton was a visionary. He was brilliant, and that's basically summarizing. He wrote 51 of the 85 articles within the Federalist Papers. So he was brilliant, and I get it. I get where he was coming from, and I understand why he was a visionary. If Hamilton, as being brilliant, was fire, Madison, being cool, calm, and collected, was ice. Fire and ice. And as partners in drafting the Federalist Papers, they were a good match. So what it's been said is that by historians feel that by a close vote of 30 to 27, the New York Convention voted in favor of approving the Constitution. Now that was one reason it was approved, because of the Federalist Papers. The second reason it was approved was New Hampshire and Virginia expedited approval at their conventions. They became the 9th and 10th states to join under the new Constitution, discarding the Articles of Confederation. So the delegates at the convention in New York were concerned that if they held out and didn't join the United States under the Constitution, that the federal government could, in trading with New York's trading with New Jersey and Connecticut and other states, tariffs could be slapped against New York exports, and it would be a financial hardship on New York. So that's the second reason. By a narrow margin, a lot of people who were against the federal system voted for it at the convention. The third reason that the conventioners decided to go with and join the United States under the new Constitution stems from the fact that there was a motion that was passed at the convention in which a Bill of Rights containing freedom of speech, freedom of press, and trial by jury, and other things, other points of law that we take for granted, that needed to be proved within 4 years. Otherwise, New York would secede from the Union. So what happened was New York approved at its convention and became the 11th out of 13 states to join the United States, thus discarding the Articles of Confederation. And within 2.5 years after the Constitution was approved, James Madison introduced the Bill of Rights to the House of Representatives, where he was a legislator, and it was eventually approved, gone back and forth between the House and the Senate, and the president at that time signed it into law, and so the Bill of Rights became an addendum to the U.S. Constitution. So that about sums up this chapter of how Madison and Hamilton partnered together before, during, and after the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and also how why Madison is the father of the U.S. Constitution, and he's also father of the Bill of Rights. Now let's talk about the third chapter. Let's talk about what Madison and Hamilton did as senior executive officers in the Federalist government during the first, third, and fourth administrations, presidential administrations, and how they were rivals for a period of time, but eventually, at the end of the day, and this is the happy story, is that even though they had different temperaments and different political philosophies and joined different political parties, and one was from the North and the other one was from the South, they were able to join together and align what was in the best interest of the United States. They were able to come together. So let's first talk about Hamilton. He was the first Secretary of Treasury. He was Secretary of Treasury less than 5.5 years, but what he stuffed into 5.5 years is remarkable. You could write doctoral dissertations based upon his for each of his 7 major reports that he submitted to Congress. Time prevents us from talking about each of them and going into depth, but let me try to summarize. Hamilton submitted a report on credit, one on manufacturers, one on taxes, one on establishing a Bank of the U.S., and so on. And what that did was it created a Bank of the United States, which was 5 times larger than any bank in the United States whatsoever. And the federal government retained 20% ownership in the bank. And the Bank of the U.S. is considered the predecessor of the Federal Reserve Bank, which is in power today. Hamilton also was involved in the creation of the U.S. Mint to coin silver and gold coins. He also was involved in creating a report which made it possible for the U.S. Coast Guard to come into being. The reason we needed a U.S. Coast Guard was we needed lighthouse all along the Atlantic coast to prevent ships trading between states and trading between the United States and other countries from crashing into reefs and coming into port safely. So those lighthouses were part of what became eventually became the U.S. Coast Guard, and also the U.S. Coast Guard was tasked with the responsibility of intercepting smugglers. By intercepting smugglers, you're able to limit contraband being brought to the U.S., and you're able to assess tariffs against people who wanted to forego having to pay that cost. So it was for the better of the United States. Also, Hamilton endorsed taxation, excise taxes on whiskey. They were terribly unpopular, but George Washington backed each of Hamilton's programs. Also, tariffs were assessed against imports from Britain and France. You see, Hamilton had a concept. The United States at this time was rural and agrarian, and Hamilton had a concept that in the national security interest of the country, the United States needed to be able to do more than grow crops. We needed to manufacture goods, and he understood technology was changing, and we needed to be on the cutting edge of new technologies. And banks would fund this, and the United States needed to transition to manufacturing. And so Hamilton was well ahead of his time, and he was opposed to on tariffs, on excise taxes, on transitioning from less reliance on agriculture and transitioning over to manufacturing. Madison and Jefferson, they were Democrat Republicans. Hamilton was a Federalist. They were at odds with each other politically, and Madison and Jefferson believed that banks were evil. Their personal temperament, their political philosophy, their political party differed from Alexander Hamilton. So what Hamilton did is he cut a deal with Madison and Jefferson. He met with them for dinner, and he agreed with George Washington's backing to allow the federal government's capital in Philadelphia to move to District of Columbia, which occupied part of Virginia and Maryland. He allowed that to be moved within 10 years, to the District of Columbia. And in exchange, the paying one of his financial plans was to pay off the federal government's debt to foreign countries and the state's debt to foreign countries. And Madison and Jefferson agreed to part of Hamilton's financial plan, and Hamilton, through Washington and Congress, it was agreed to, within 10 years, to move the capital to the District of Columbia. After Washington passed away, it was named Washington, D.C., and at times Washington City. And Jefferson became the first president of the United States to work out of Washington, D.C. There was no White House. Jefferson actually lived in a boarding house at the time. So the thing that's really interesting is that Jefferson and Madison, over time, even though for the reasons I've just articulated, disagreed in Hamilton, plus it was his personality. As I stated previously, Hamilton was fire and Madison was ice. So when Jefferson became president, Madison became a Secretary of State. And within a year or two after becoming president, Jefferson came into office as a small government conservative. But the French made an offer to Jefferson as president and Madison as Secretary of State to sell what's been known as the Louisiana Purchase. That included the state of Louisiana and other territories that became states. So they agreed to the terms, and they agreed to pay the French $15 million. And overnight, the United States doubled the landmass of the United States. So Jefferson may have started out thinking, I'm for the agrarian farmer, and I'm for a stronger federal government, but I'm for smaller government. And by doubling the size of the United States, he freed up the Mississippi River for trade up and down the river, and he solidified our defenses along the western border at the time, the Mississippi River. He expanded the United States so more people could settle. There'd be more land. People would be able to own more land, and there'd be an increase in agriculture and manufactures. So what also happened that is very interesting, this is while Jefferson was president and also while Madison was president. The United States was engaged in a couple of wars. The War of 1812, the British came into Washington